Hello, and welcome to this think tank talk. Thank you so much for joining on this beautiful summer day. The sun is so nice outside. I'm so glad to having you here. It's an honor. Today we are going to talk about a thematic that's really relevant. It has always been relevant, still is very much. And the title is Excluded and Invisible: How to Protect Stateless People. And we are super happy to have the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung here today, who is collaborating with us on this event. For those of you who haven't heard about the Think Tank Hub, the Think Tank Hub is a platform in collaboration between FORAS, the Think Tank on Foreign Policy, and the FDFA, that promotes think tanks and connects them to International Geneva and its ecosystem. And one of the activities we do are the Think Tank Talk series, which aim to present what think tanks are doing in regards and that are on topics that are relevant for International Geneva. So we also want to foster a discussion, use the opportunity to have all these great speakers here. So please feel free to switch on your videos, to raise your hands if you have questions. We will start with an introduction of each of the panelists will give a 5-minute input. They will talk about the report that the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung has launched on the issue of stateless, the Atlas of Stateless People. And feel free to raise your hand throughout the talks, but also especially in the end, we will encourage you to talk. So please be aware that the session is recorded. If you don't feel comfortable to show your face, just keep the camera off or change your name if you don't want to be recognized. And also feel free to write your questions in the chat also. We will check the chat regularly. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce to you the topic a bit. So as you know, it is, or maybe you don't know, but it is actually very hard to say how many stateless people there actually exist, because data barely exists. And statelessness can be a consequence of many reasons. We'll get more into details later. But one of the main problems, and I think this is also addressed in the report, is the access of stateless people to their rights. And I'm very happy to talk about this more in detail with our speakers today. We have Eva Wuchold, Melanie Kanna, Catherine Southwick, and Chris Nash, who will talk a bit more about this. And Eva, I leave you the floor. So a bit of about your background. So you're the program director for social rights at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung here in Geneva, and also the coordinator of the Atlas of the Stateless People project, of the Stateless, excuse me, that we're going to talk about today. So please, Eva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria. Yes, yeah, I'm the program director at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung here in Geneva. The Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is an internationally active, progressive, non-profit organization for political education, and Geneva is one of our most recent offices. We have offices all around the world, yeah, this was the 28th office, and yeah, we're very happy to be here. And actually, the Atlas of the Stateless project was the first major project that we did in 2019, because we had only just arrived to Geneva a couple of months before. And yeah, that somehow shows that we take the issue of statelessness serious. Yeah, it was just the start of our work with regard to statelessness. The Atlas itself tried to briefly and compactly outline the topic of statelessness, which, as you said before, at least to a broader public, is often not so well known. we compiled 25 articles presenting many different facets of the topic and also using very concrete country examples. There are articles on the deprivation of citizenship, flight or expulsion, religious discrimination, the consequences of a nomadic way of life, as well as on children born stateless, women unable to pass on their nationality to their children, or migrants unable to naturalize in their countries of residence. Our aim as the foundation was to make the topic of stateless more visible on the one hand, but on the other hand also to show possible solutions for the respective situations and also the problems that are there. In designing the atlas, we were concerned with human rights that everyone is entitled to. That is also the big aim of the project on social rights that I'm running here in Geneva. We wanted to make it clear that our society and the international community of states are far from having the right to rights as a guiding principle in everyday consciousness and political action. And it was particularly nice that we were able to win many renowned authors for the atlas, and 3 of them are also here today, which I'm very happy about. I guess we will learn a lot more on the topic of statelessness in the different contexts in the following contributions by our colleagues. And I don't want to anticipate them, and I think I also cannot, even if I wanted. Just a couple of introductory words from my side. For us as the foundation, it was important to emphasize, and it still is important, that any real solution to statelessness requires more than the acquisition of a nationality. If we want to solve the problem of statelessness, we need to move beyond a state-centered understanding of the right to a nationality and understand nationality more as the content of a human right to citizenship. And what we need is a nationality that provides a meaningful link between a person and a state, enabling that person to actively enjoy the rights associated with a nationality, which many of us take as a privilege. So eliminating statelessness, that does not only mean giving people the right to return to where they came from, for example, because when they arrive there, they are often without other rights than they have been in the country where they were before. The first step to solving the problem is to recognize it. And we also had a couple of articles on that data collection is very important. And it's the basis to find more ways for stateless people to gain some kind of official status. And I guess that Melanie is also talking about that later on, because this is already supposed to be happening as it is enshrined in the 1954 convention relating to the status of stateless persons. But in the current political climate, with more nationalist governments in the forefront, I guess there's even more at stake for stateless people than it maybe was before. And under the political pressure to limit immigration in general, there could be even more an incentive for states to turn away stateless people before they can become residents in need of regularization. So there have been, and I think Chris knows a lot more about this, illegal repatriations and all kinds of things happening like this also within Europe even. So I guess it's not only up to the state, the individual state, to solve the problem of statelessness, but it's also up to civil society pressure. And that's also why we launched the Atlas project, because civil society needs to be informed about the topic and about the problems related to being stateless. And I think we need to raise social pressure so that it comes a moment where political decision makers can no longer ignore the issue as such. So I think the more people that get involved with stateless people and the topic of stateless people, the more visible the issue becomes, the greater the likelihood that solutions will also be found at the state level. So yeah, and then beyond the Atlas of Stateless, maybe this could also, beyond the topic of statelessness, maybe this could also in general lead to a discussion about what citizens' rights are, and maybe even if the concept of state as we know it today really serves the people, or creates an atmosphere in which topics or problems like statelessness are to be solved, or if we could somehow, or if we have to somehow go into a different direction in the future. So yeah, as I said before, the Atlas project was just the starting point for us. We are still very new in Geneva, especially with the lockdown. But yeah, very happy to have the Atlas there, and also other corporations with organizations working on the topic of statelessness. And also very happy that you took up this topic today, to have other people listen that probably haven't heard about the topic so much before. So thanks a lot for the invitation, and I'm very curious to listen to what Melanie now has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. And yes, Melanie, I think you will be able to give us a bit more insight on the topic of statelessness. So to introduce you quickly, Melanie Kanna is a senior legal coordinator and section chief for statelessness at the UNHCR. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to Think Tank Hub for hosting this event. And thank you to the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation for working on the Atlas project. It's really an innovative and I think interesting piece of work. My contribution to the Atlas was called Putting Statelessness on the Front Burner. And that perfectly describes what UNHCR, as the UN agency that has the mandate to address statelessness, is trying to do. Statelessness is not a household word. Everybody with us today will know that. If you ask 10 people on the street what statelessness is, 8 of them are likely to give you the wrong answer. So we still have a long way to go in raising awareness and forging the political will for solutions. But that is indeed what we're trying to do. And to kind of up the ante on that effort, as many of you will know, in 2014, our previous High Commissioner, now Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, launched a very ambitious 10-year campaign to try to end statelessness by 2024. That campaign launch was accompanied with a global action plan to end statelessness that has 10 concrete actions that states and others in the international community, civil society, very importantly, the UN system, are all encouraged to take to try to reach the goal of ending statelessness. So there are very concrete things that we can all be working on together. Each of the 10 actions has an associated timeline and target. If you're interested in learning more about the Global Action Plan and UNHCR's campaign in general, I encourage you to go to UNHCR's website, so unhcr.org/I belong. So I thought I would just talk for a little bit about how we're doing on this ambitious campaign, give you sort of a lay of the land. As Eva already mentioned, we don't know exactly how many people are stateless globally, so that's a bit of a hindrance from the starting block. UNHCR used to have an estimate of 10 million people. We've tried to kind of move away from using that estimate because frankly, there was no rigorous methodology behind it. We report on approximately 4.2 million people as being stateless in our statistical reporting. But the truth is, we have no idea what the real global figure is, because that number, 4.2 million, is based on data from just about 70 countries globally. We have no data whatsoever from many of the most populated countries in the world. We don't report data on China, on Nigeria, on Indonesia, and I could go on and on. So to start with, we don't have a terrific idea of how many people are stateless, but we do know that it's millions. And the World Bank recently put out an estimate of 1.1 billion people globally not having any documentary proof of their identity. If that figure is correct, the number of stateless people globally might be quite a bit higher than the old 10 million estimate. Suffice it to say, it's a problem affecting millions of people around the world and all continents of the world. We have done a good job, I think, in raising awareness generally as compared to what the situation was pre-2014. And one very easy, good indicator of that is the fact that we now have a number of regional declarations and national action plans totally dedicated to statelessness. Not a single one of those existed pre-2014, and they're now regional declarations covering almost all regions of the globe. Likewise, there are now civil society networks like the one that Chris heads, the European Network on Statelessness, covering almost all regions of the globe. So some very concrete indications that there's raised interest and awareness, including in regions that frankly, before wouldn't acknowledge that this was an issue, wouldn't acknowledge that the phenomenon of statelessness even existed, particularly parts of Africa, I would say. And then concretely in terms of progress, how are we doing? I can say that over the last decade, so going back a bit farther than the beginning of the campaign, we are aware of approximately 800,000 previously stateless people having been granted nationality. So that's good, that's important, but it's obviously not enough to put us on track towards ending statelessness by 2024 if the real number of stateless people is over 10 million. But also on the positive side, we've had 25 new accessions to one or both of the UN Statelessness Conventions since the campaign was launched in 2014. That's hugely important because those two treaties contain the standards that if all states in the world applied them, would effectively wipe out statelessness within a generation. Also very concretely, we are aware of at least 11 countries that have reformed their nationality laws to strengthen the safeguards in the nationality law that prevent statelessness at birth. So cutting off statelessness at the root. And of course, that's exactly what the 1961 Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness was meant to do. 2 states globally, Madagascar and Sierra Leone, have reformed their nationality laws to remove gender discrimination that hindered a mother's ability to confer nationality on her child since the campaign was launched. Unfortunately, there are still 25 states globally that hinder a mother's ability to confer nationality on her child. We've seen many states, and this goes to the point that Eva was making about stateless status. We've seen many states since the campaign was launched, at least 16 that we're aware of, having adopted statelessness determination procedures. So procedures to, just like they sound, assess whether or not somebody is stateless, and if they are, provide them with a protected status and a certain suite of rights. Unfortunately, as compared with asylum determination procedures, the coverage globally is still very low. But we're now up to at least 26 states globally that have statelessness determination procedures, which is a big increase as compared with where we were in 2014. We're also seeing improvements in birth registration procedures globally, and that's very important because, of course, the two ways that people can typically prove an entitlement to nationality are either where they were born or who their parents are, or a combination of the two. Not having your birth registered isn't the same thing as being stateless, but people who don't have their births registered, who are members of minority groups, for example, can find themselves at risk of statelessness if the dominant group wants to challenge their belonging. I think the advent of the Sustainable Development Goals is going to give us a boost in this regard, especially because there's one SDG, SDG 16.9, that is specifically about providing legal identity to all, including birth registration by 2030. We've also benefited from stronger partnerships since the campaign was launched. Within the UN family, together with UNICEF, we launched a new coalition on every child's right to a nationality in 2016. And I'm happy to say that that coalition is active at the country level in supporting concrete statelessness-related projects in over 20 countries now. We also have a group of friends of the campaign, a member state group that meets regularly in Geneva to help carry this issue forward diplomatically, including through the UN human rights mechanisms, especially the Universal Periodic Review, where the number of recommendations dedicated to statelessness or relevant to statelessness doubled in the second cycle of the UPR versus the first. And the Friends of the Campaign also ran the first right to a nationality resolution at the Human Rights Council in 2016. I mentioned already civil society. We have much stronger civil society interest than we did pre-campaign. I think in addition to the dedicated regional networks on statelessness that I mentioned, there's a greater understanding by more mainstream child's rights organizations, women's rights organizations, minorities' rights organizations, that this is an issue that they should care about also, that this issue links to all of those things. It's not a technical, obscure, thing that lives somewhere by itself. It connects very much to the lives of real people and people's rights. So those are the positive developments I would cite. There are, of course, persistent challenges and new ones on the horizon. In the persistent challenges category, one can't fail to mention Myanmar and the situation of the Rohingya, which I know Catherine will talk about in more detail. So I'll just say that it's very notable that the situation of the world's best known stateless group and likely single largest stateless group at over 1 million identified persons, the situation of the Rohingya has only gotten much worse in the time that we've run this campaign. Also in the category of challenges, and Ava alluded to this, I would say, indeed, the rise of nationalism in many parts of the world, and particularly pernicious forms of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, religious nationalism, are very troubling because this issue relates so much to inclusive societies and fundamental issues of belonging. So, for example, in India, where the government has launched an exercise to try to assess the citizenship of the population of Assam, a state that is known to have a large Muslim population, we see very clearly, the linkage between, the dominant group's idea of who should belong and what may, follow, which at worst, may be the biggest new situation of citizenship in many, many years, if not ever. So that's something we're watching closely. And then I would also just flag that, we've seen a rise in recent years in the number of states that are attracted to deprivation of citizenship as a counterterrorism measure, even though there's no evidence that taking somebody's citizenship away is an effective counterterrorism measure. We recently put out new guidelines on that topic that I hope will help. And finally, climate change. I think when people think about statelessness and climate change, they tend to think of a scenario involving sinking small island states, the total disappearance of not very populated small island states and the possibility that the inhabitants of those states would wind up stateless. I think that is a little bit of a red herring, to be honest, in relation to the likely numerically much more significant potential statelessness associated with climate change in years to come, based on the tens of millions of people who we expect to be displaced across international boundaries permanently in years to come by climate. And the linkage there is essentially, when people are in prolonged forced displacement, the risk factors for statelessness increase. And these are many, including, potential loss of documents in flight, family separation, conflicts of laws, challenges accessing birth registration, and over time, challenges with respect to entitlement to nationality. So it's a particular risk for future generations. Just to end on a positive note, I would say that we were very pleased that in 2019, when we convened a high-level segment on statelessness, we attracted 360 new pledges by governments and others to work on the issue, 252 of which, by the way, were pledges from governments. And governments are, of course, the most important actors when it comes to statelessness, because only governments can provide nationality. So looking ahead, perhaps glass half full, glass half empty, some very good achievements, some nice momentum, some hope in the form of those pledges and other things, but also, some worrying clouds on the horizon and a need for accelerated progress on this issue. Thank you very much, and over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for this really interesting introduction, and congratulations to this project that seems super successful. Although I imagine it's always a struggle, but we can really see the impact. So congratulations. You mentioned the Rohingyas, and I'm actually super happy to welcome Catherine Southwick, who will tell us more about this issue. Catherine is an independent contractor at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the floor is yours, Catherine.
Hi, good morning from Washington, D.C. It's a real pleasure to join you, and I really appreciated Melanie's remarks regarding persistent challenges in particular, and also the progress that has been made on the campaign. It's a real change since I first started looking at statelessness now almost 15 years ago, when it was really just an unknown thing. But in any case, I'm here because I contributed a section to the atlas on the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. And as some of you may not know, Rohingya are a minority group from Western Myanmar. They're mostly Muslim, but not entirely so. Some Rohingya are also Christians and other kind of religious backgrounds. I'll say just a brief word about sort of the context of statelessness as it concerns that case. And I'll say also a word on the implications of the military coup from February earlier this year, as well as I think also implications in terms of international obligations that come into play under the cases that had been launched at the International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice, and also the Argentinian case that was started under universal jurisdiction principles. All of those started in 2019. the key point, I think, to understand about the Rohingya when it comes to denial of access to citizenship, and I kind of prefer to call it denial of access to citizenship because many of the Rohingya don't consider themselves stateless. They've been denied access to citizenship under the laws and through the implementation of discriminatory laws within Myanmar. But in any case, here I'm going to talk about them as stateless as it relates to their denial of access to citizenship in the state where they most obviously have the clearest connections and right to nationality. But the point to understand is that it is a longstanding case of denying access to rights and citizenship based on ethno-nationalist policies promulgated over almost the last 50 years by the military-led government. Statelessness is a consequence and also a cause of ongoing discrimination and persecution, which in turn, especially in the last decade, amidst Myanmar's erstwhile democratic transition, created an atmosphere of intense polarization that resulted in mass violence and large-scale displacement in 2017, especially leading to almost 1 million refugees residing in sprawling camps in Bangladesh, and as of the last few months, on some isolated islands in the Bay of Bengal. The lack of citizenship has coincided with and enabled other discriminatory laws and policies against the Rohingya, denying them the right to vote, restricting their movement, limiting access to livelihoods, education, healthcare, even food, as well as limits on the right to marry and have children. These extreme conditions compelled many Rohingya to leave the country, paying traffickers exorbitant sums to take them to uncertain futures. Hundreds, although we don't know how many, perish at sea each year, stranded on boats in the region, with surrounding states sort of unwilling to rescue or admit them within their own borders. In a 2015 report, the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary University cited the denial of citizenship as among the stages of genocide as it applied to the Rohingya, and that the 1982 citizenship law that is sort of seen as the root of their de facto or de jure statelessness, depending on how you want to look at it, was a, quote, key moment in repositioning the Rohingya outside the state sphere of responsibility. And then in 2018, the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar stated that the lack of legal status and identity is a cornerstone of the oppressive system targeting the Rohingya. And when, in terms of the way forward and how we think about the rights of states here, the future, I'm afraid, as Melanie alluded, is at this moment still looks pretty bleak and uncertain. The international community is spending close to $1 billion per year to sustain people in these, pretty miserable camps. The legal proceedings were started at the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice and so on 2 years ago. So we have sort of humanitarian assistance and international law institutions in play, but the crucial factor that has always failed to materialize in this case is a concerted diplomatic political effort to actually resolve the crisis and to work with or lean on the government to end the man-made disaster. And so clearly the state of Myanmar, as people have been saying for years, should reform its citizenship laws and the way it applies those laws. But to do that and to integrate the Rohingya requires deeper structural and social change that I think Eva was alluding to in her remarks, which would involve a political reform towards a truer version of democracy that defines national identity based on inclusion and equality. Now, notably, the protest movement that emerged after the military's coup in February offers some hope in that direction, because those mass protests have shown really a remarkable shift in public consciousness vis-a-vis the Rohingya and favoring generally equality and inclusion for all ethnic groups in Myanmar. The opposition government in the context of the coup has made a statement supporting the repatriation of Rohingya and the desire to create a new citizenship law that would make it easier to access citizenship and guarantee equal rights. But the current prospects of this protest movement and the democracy movement at the moment is really quite, at best, uncertain. And as long as Myanmar is unstable and under military control, we're unlikely to see much positive change for the Rohingya on the ground. Which brings me just for 1 minute on the second sort of area of potential solutions, which relates to states' responsibilities to the stateless community beyond the state of Myanmar. And here, where we have a statelessness implicated in or as a basis for mass atrocity crimes, this arguably raises ostensible obligations of other states under responsibility to protect and even the Genocide Convention, to which most states are party. When we see that statelessness or deprivation of nationality becomes a risk factor for atrocities like genocide, then states have obligations to act. The ICJ said in 2007 that our obligation to prevent genocide and the corresponding duty to act arises at the instant the state learns of, or should normally learn of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. So this area of law and state obligations to prevent genocide is still not very well articulated, but the link here is pretty clear. And if we were to pursue the logic further, the states should be considering what else they should be doing, either to strengthen diplomatic efforts to end the turmoil in Myanmar and enable that civilian government to enact the changes that we would like to see, and two, creating alternatives beyond these sprawling, endless camps in Bangladesh through either incentivizing Bangladesh to consider alternative means to integrate the population and give them better access to livelihoods and education and a more humane existence, but also to consider increasing resettlement programs, at least for the short to medium term, until things change in Myanmar. And so in solving statelessness, we're not just talking about, I believe, a single state's responsibility. In a protracted case like this, we're also have to think about the responsibility of other states and how we imagine our obligations, not only to prevent statelessness, but to prevent mass atrocities. So thank you very much. Over back to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Well, thank you so much for zooming in on this particular case, which is also very relevant right now. So we will, Chris Nash, he will give us another case study on Europe. Chris is the director and co-founder of the European Network on Statelessness. And so to zoom in on another case and something close to most of where we are, please, Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maria, and good afternoon, everyone from London. And it's great to follow such excellent presentations. Many thanks to the think tank Hump for the invitation, and also just to acknowledge the great collaboration we have with both Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation and UNHCR, who support some of ENS's work in Europe. For those of you not familiar, the European Network on Statelessness, or ENS, is a civil society alliance of NGOs, academics, and individual experts committed to addressing statelessness. And we're pleased to have grown to now have over 170 members in 41 European countries since we founded back in 2014. In the short time I have available, I'm just going to briefly present my Atlas article, which is essentially a state of play analysis on statelessness in Europe. So Europe, and the EU in particular, often likes to see itself as a model of democracy and human rights, but it's actually home to a surprising number of stateless people, at least 500,000 in total, many born in Europe itself, but also more recent arrivals. So I think by any yardstick, the countries of Europe must do more to solve this solvable issue. And the reason I would say that is because an international legal framework that guarantees protection to stateless people and sets clear rules for preventing statelessness have been in place for at least a generation. So, it follows that if all state signatories had translated this into effective national law, the problem would have been eradicated in the region by now. But I guess identity politics, migration debates, and questions about who does and who doesn't belong have got in the way of this. In the limited time I have available, I would just pick out sort of 3 key gaps or areas in particular which require reform. So firstly, half of European states do not have full safeguards in their laws to grant nationality to children born on their territory who would otherwise be stateless, which means that thousands of children continue to grow up without a nationality in Europe. Secondly, only 12 European states have dedicated procedures in place to identify who on their territory is stateless and therefore owe protection under international law. And this leaves many stateless people in legal limbo with no way to regularize their status, but equally nowhere to go. And in that limbo, they're often at risk of detention and destitution. And thirdly, it's important to emphasize that many thousands of those forcibly displaced to Europe every year are stateless, but asylum laws and policy too often fail to adequately address their specific protection needs. So, for example, Syria is a good example of a country with a large in situ stateless population and gender discriminatory nationality laws. There are many Syrian asylum seekers in Europe, but where they're stateless, their protection needs are not being addressed. And this sort of failure to tackle statelessness in a horizontal and cross-cutting way as part of Europe's refugee response is also evidenced in the draft instruments under the EU Asylum and Migration Pact, which is something that we at ENS are working hard to try and change. So in short, countries across Europe could fix all these areas I just mentioned if they showed sufficient political will and put in place laws and policies that implement their obligations under international law. And again, it's worth highlighting that almost all European states have signed up to the 2 main UN conventions, as well as other relevant human rights instruments. So there's a gap between what they've signed up to and the rights, the respect for rights on the ground. So mindful of this, a few years ago at ENS, we designed and developed our Statelessness Index, which contains comparative information on 27 countries, showing exactly what needs to change. So this online tool, the index, benchmarks the performance of countries against the international standards they have signed up to, thereby hopefully encouraging reform and holding governments to account. But it's designed not only to support advocacy, but also to give officials the tools they need to draft better legislation and showcasing good practices, as well as providing a source of information to stateless people themselves. But equally, building a case and creating political space for change is only part of the solution. Something we're very conscious of is that a key challenge for all of us working on the statelessness issue is how to better engage with people directly affected by statelessness, who are too often missing from the debate. And it cannot be emphasized enough that stateless people don't fall into a single category, and we need to recognize their diverse, individual, and myriad identities. So they are different genders, ages, sexual orientation, social economic backgrounds, abilities, languages, religions, and ethnicities. Stateless people have their own agency and voice and must be heard as part of the decision-making processes that affect their lives, whether that's at a local, national, or regional level. And ultimately, the causes and consequences of statelessness can only be effectively addressed if the multiple identities and experiences of those directly affected by it are taken into account, and if the link between statelessness and racism, patriarchy, or other forms of oppression are properly understood. So in conclusion, and in trying to tie things together, whether we see the cup as half full or half empty, it is important to acknowledge that recently important progress has been made, including following advocacy done jointly by NGOs, UNHCR, and others, and certainly very helpfully galvanized by UNHCR's I Belong campaign, which Melanie talked about earlier. So there has been real progress. And in Europe, for example, over the last decade, 7 European states have acceded to the UN Statelessness Conventions, and 9 countries have reformed national laws to either grant protection to stateless people or to better prevent statelessness. However, while these state-led initiatives and reforms are welcome, we believe that they're insufficient and hence what is really now needed is urgent attention by regional bodies in order to really catalyze reform and help us move towards ending statelessness. So, for example, despite landmark European Council conclusions in 2015, rallying cries from the European Parliament and various Council of Europe initiatives, Europe still lacks a common approach to statelessness akin to regional strategies adopted in, for example, in the Americas and West Africa, which Melanie also alluded to earlier. And it's certainly the case that the next phase of UNHCR's I Belong campaign will very importantly continue to galvanize action. But ending statelessness in Europe will take longer than just 3 years. It will require new coalitions with people affected, more prioritization of the issue by regional institutions, and an ever closer monitoring of law, policy, and practice to hold governments to account. And at ENS, we very much stand ready to support these efforts and to strive for a Europe where everyone has the right to a nationality. In our view, it's just essential that if Europe is to uphold its values of freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, then this vision urgently needs to be realized. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much, Chris, for this very insightful presentation of Europe. I would now like to invite all of you to ask questions. Feel free to either turn on the camera and just ask your question, or write it directly in the chat and I will ask it for you. If anyone wants to ask a question, otherwise I have some questions, but it would be more interesting, I think, to hear all our audience this question. So maybe I will start with one question. So maybe first question to you, Eva. You said that according to the data collected in Atlas of the Stateless, 95 states don't have data on statelessness. And do you think that, or maybe also for the other panelists, do you think that this lack of statistics can be linked to desire to avoid obligations under international law regarding the reduction of statelessness? What are your thoughts on this? Maybe Eva, or if any of you wants to respond to this.
Yeah, we had the example of Lebanon, for example, in the Atlas with regard to the lack of data on stateless people, and from what the authors in the Atlas came up with, it was quite clear that there's also political motivation behind not collecting data. In many cases, and maybe other cases, there are different reasons for it, but I guess that there are some states that don't really want to know or publish how many stateless people live in their territory, because it would mean political action that they are not really willing to take. So, but yeah, Melanie probably knows more.
Well, no, just to complement what you just said, Dave, I think you're absolutely right. I think the reasons that states, typically don't gather data on stateless persons vary. In some cases, it may be, complete lack of awareness of the issue. Historically, I certainly think that was the case for many states. It can also be just lack of capacity, lack of awareness in the National Statistics Office about what the correct definition of a stateless person is and what the best practices are, in terms of how to gather data on these people who, do tend to be invisible, right? They're not necessarily living congregated in camps the way refugees are. So it's an inherently less visible phenomenon, if you like. And then there are absolutely cases where data is not being gathered for political reasons. Just to flag that I kind of started with the data gap in my presentation today. I started with the data gap as something that was very much on my mind when I started this job, being the chief of UNHCR's statelessness section nearly 6 years ago now. And we've been working so hard to try to come up with, let's say, kind of the gold standard way of addressing it, the best possible way, because for many years it's been sort of, rubber bands and paper clips, I would say, lots of little studies here and there, some done by NGOs, some done by academics, very often funded wholly or partially by UNHCR. But those kinds of, small scale studies, which is what they mainly are, can only get you so far. And I'm very pleased to be able to share with all of you that we are now working with the expert group on international refugee statistics, EGRIS, which is a subgroup of the UN Statistical Commission, to have developed a new set of international recommendations on statelessness statistics. It's a mouthful, so they're going to be called the IROS. And a draft has been developed. It will be subject to peer review and a big global consultation process that the UN Statistical Commission will conduct. And the ambition is to have this adopted, have the IROS adopted in 2023. If that happens, I think that will be a game-changing thing, because it precisely will, both capacitate and motivate states to collect data on statelessness.
Super interesting. Yes, please, Chris.
Yeah, really just to echo with the useful points made by Ava and Melanie, and certainly our Statelessness Index, one of the things that monitors is the availability and adequacy of data on statelessness in different countries across Europe. And if you look at the index, which has a scoring system, that's an area where states consistently score quite low. And it's important to emphasize that ultimately the responsibility to gather this data does lie with states. So it's great to have initiatives, such as the one Melanie describes, and organizations such as UNHCR and other advocates, really important that other advocates encourage states to keep better data. And there are ways that this can be done through improved censusness, improved methodologies on census data collection, coming back to the importance of status determination procedures. Obviously, if you don't have, procedures in place to identify stateless people, it becomes a slightly chicken and egg situation in terms of the data not being accurate. And ultimately, the reason why this is important, because if you can't see a problem, you can't solve it, right? So, we definitely need better data. Thanks.
Yes, please, Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reasons for why the statistics are lacking are many, but as I think Eva pointed out, and Melanie as well, some of the reasons is that the states don't necessarily want to find out, and there may be a political will issue there, and but that, to me, in a way, indicates that states deep down intuitively understand that they do have a responsibility for persons in their territory who are not accessing rights. And so in some ways, there's sort of a silver lining in that space to work on and to develop. And I would also say that, the more if we can sort of track in states like what the root of the lack of statistics is, that would be a good indicator as to what sort of is the nature of the problem of statelessness as well. If it's a question of political will and exclusion or discrimination, or if it's a question of capacity, that may be that has a broader implication for what is causing statelessness in the state to begin with. But I would also just point out that statistics aren't everything. I mean, we've known that there are hundreds of thousands to over 1 million Rohingya without access to citizenship for many decades. And that really hasn't changed the political calculus and effort to remedy that situation.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And I think that's actually a very important point, isn't it? Because we are talking a lot about data these days. It's of course very important, but of course just the data on its own doesn't solve the problem. Thank you so much for your inputs. I think we have a question from Timothy. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question. It's for Chris. In the atlas on page 55, I think it's mentioned that the EU has made some efforts regarding statelessness, but like a very few. But my question is like, many people think the EU has failed regarding the refugee crisis of 2015. There was the controversy agreement around the agreement between Turkey and the EU. The Dublin system didn't work out. And my question is even if the EU had the political will to make efforts and create a whole system for the whole European Union, do you think that, like, would it be legitimate for the EU to do this? Like, people would trust the EU, or do you think that it only depends on state and regional initiatives to solve the problem?
Thanks, and that's a big question. So I'm trying to think how best to answer. I think the first point to make is that the EU, there are questions around competency in terms of what the EU can do to address statelessness. So, for example, it's well understood that the EU member states, they retain sovereignty to decide, who acquires citizenship. But nonetheless, the EU has a child rights agenda. And, if you ignore statelessness as part of the child rights agenda, it's the big elephant in the room, right? Because, when is it in the best interest of a child to be stateless? Never. So, and we're very encouraged by some progress we've made in getting the European Commission to acknowledge, the importance of addressing childhood statelessness, birth registration, related issues as part of its child rights strategy. That being said, in terms of the EU sort of responsibility to protect stateless people in a migratory context, here we would argue there is a much clearer competence, and this is one reason why we're so keen to engage, with sort of the Common European Asylum System, including, more recently, Asylum and Migration Pact. But if what I understood behind your question, there is a lot of cynicism and, I guess, unhappiness and lack of confidence in the ability of the EU to agree, any sort of a common asylum policy, let alone a progressive one. So it probably we're a long way off thinking about common harmonized procedures on determining statelessness. But again, there's still many things that the EU could do, within its refugee response, within the Asylum and Migration Pact, to better address statelessness, identifying it at screening, so that children who are at risk of statelessness, that gets identified and safeguards can be applied, making sure that statelessness is identified in return or removal proceedings, so it states people that end up in detention, looking at other rights around, family reunion, integration and regularization, and making sure that where people apply for asylum but aren't recognized as refugees, that that they then have access to stateless determination procedures where they're at risk of statelessness, so that can be properly considered and that can offer a regularization route to them. And some of this importance, was acknowledged when the European Council adopted the first ever conclusions on statelessness in 2015, but we're a little bit disappointed that there hasn't been more progress since then. At the time you had Luxembourg hosting the EU presidency, really championing the issue. I think what we need now is some other member states who have the presidency of the EU to champion the issue. Sorry, it was a big question, so a long answer and an incomplete answer almost by nature, but thanks for the question.
Thanks for your answer.
Thank you so much, Chris. And we've actually almost, the time is almost over. I would just, as a closing question, ask all the panelists. So how optimistic are you about the issue of statelessness? Do you see a real political will of the states to engage and to actually fight this problem? How do you see the future of statelessness, maybe as a final comment? And I don't know who wants to start, maybe Catherine? No?
you know, as I said at the very beginning, you know, that where the statelessness is as an issue in terms of global awareness is miles further than where it was when I first started paying attention to the issue as a scholar and an advocate. But I feel like in a way it's like the glass is maybe 20% full. So I want to be, you know, I want to focus on the positive, but we still have such a long way to go. And there are still protracted challenges underlying the statelessness and the causes of statelessness. And this really requires, I think, sort of a dramatic reassessment of international consciousness. And I think, again, I think the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is sort of trying to open that space to discuss what, you know, whether we even need states anymore. I mean, we can't go maybe that far right now or in the next, you know, in time for the global action plan, but we really need to really, especially as we're entering this phase of Melanie said, rising ethno-nationalism, and how that in itself is an indicator of what sort of state you're living in, and whether it's more authoritarian or more democratic. And this, whether we solve statelessness and address statelessness is also an indication of how seriously we take the whole challenge in front of us about what's the nature of governance, you know, globally moving forward. So that's what I hope. And I feel like there are spaces that are opening up that discussion. And I just want to end, I'm so heartened by the consciousness shift. We could all take a cue from the protest movements in Myanmar and how quickly that has changed, and how quickly across all levels of society, people have come to embrace and really make substantial sacrifices for a vision of a democratic future that is based on equality and inclusion. So that's what I'll.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Yes, I see Melanie and Chris both reacting. Please, Melanie, I think you were first, and then Chris.
Thanks. I mean, I think there's just no question that it's a mixed picture, right? You can point to specific countries and even specific reasons where I would say I have absolute, you know, optimism. I think, for example, that Central Asia may be on track to end statelessness by 2024. I think it's fantastic that, you know, so many countries in Africa now have national action plans, new task forces, you know, devoted to the issue. Rwanda, as an example, you know, they're sort of all over this issue all of a sudden, and they're absolute causes for concern, and progress is going to be uneven. Causes for concern, I think Catherine is absolutely right. You know, this issue is linked to, you know, fundamental questions of belonging and what kind of, you know, society we are, you know, any given society. It's fundamentally linked to discrimination. You know, you can see statelessness as potentially on a spectrum somewhere between gerrymandering and genocide. And if you sort of, you know, understand that, then you understand, you know, there's always going to be cause for concern. But I do think there's some potential for breakthroughs still. Just back quickly to the data issue and why I think it's important. You know, we've long had a dialogue with the World Bank about, you know, how much they can kind of do to partner with us on this issue. And the partnership with the World Bank on the refugee issue has been absolutely groundbreaking for UNHCR. The World Bank has leverage with governments that UNHCR simply doesn't have. And when we talk to the bank about this issue, it's very difficult for them to get behind it in the same way as they have with the refugee issue, because we're unable to say how many millions of people are stateless and how much poorer they are than citizens. If we had those two things, you know, if we were able to say, for example, and I'm making this number up, I don't don't take this as an estimate, 35 million people globally are stateless, and they're 3 times as poor on average, as citizens, you'd suddenly have the World Bank's attention in a big way, because their mission is ending global poverty. So I do hold out hope for sort of, game-changing things coming down the pike. But I also have plenty of causes of concern on my radar screen as well. Over to others. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And Chris, please, you had also a reaction.
Yeah, so I'm naturally a half cup full type of person, but my head would have to agree with Catherine that we're probably more like at 20% of the glass full at the moment. But it really is amazing the progress that has been made in the last, just the last 10 years, as both Catherine and Melanie alluded to. When I set up ENS back in 2012, there was literally a handful of NGOs working on statelessness in Europe, and now we have over 100 NGOs as part of our network. And most importantly, now many stateless people and community-led organisations as part of our network helping to drive this advocacy and call for reform. So that's really important, and undoubtedly UNHCR's I Belong campaign has been a really sort of useful catalyst and backdrop to some of this progress. And I think something which will be really important is that that UNHCR continues to prioritise statelessness when the campaign finishes by 2024, because obviously no one expects that statelessness will be eradicated by then. And then I guess the other point to highlight is, and I think Melanie alluded to it in her presentation, it's, seeing statelessness as an intersectional issue and the need to mainstream across nexus areas, so forced migration, child rights, anti-discrimination, development, security. Statelessness is so relevant to all of these areas, and we've made progress, but there's still a lot more mainstreaming and engagement to be done. And events like today are really important to help mainstreaming and raise awareness. And not to sort of end by talking about money, but resourcing is important. So having foundations such as Rosa-Luxemburg prioritize this issue is important. Having UNHCR continue to be resourced to properly address this part of its mandate is important. So overall exciting to see all the progress made. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. And Eva,
I'll make it very short. I'm by nature an optimistic person, and I also try to be optimistic with regard to the issue of statelessness. And I think the more people know about it, the greater the civil action will be towards ending it. And I think then, only through this kind of pressure, and Catherine talked about the big protests in Myanmar, only through this kind of pressure in the street, I think there'll be the political action following. But I always try to look at it from a positive perspective.
That is actually a great last word. Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you so much to all the panelists for joining us today. Thank you to all the people in the audience. If you have questions to the panelists, please send us an email at info@thinktankhub.org. Think Tank Hub Geneva, sorry. We will write the email address in the chat. So if you have questions, you can write there. You will also receive an email from us with a quick wrap up, so you can see also with the link to the session if you want to re-see the session. You can see the email address in the chat right now. Please feel free to reach out if you have any question, inputs, and if you are interested in the Think Tank Talk series, there is a link in the follow-up email where you can sign up for the updates on what we are doing. Thank you so much again for joining us today, and have a lovely afternoon, and enjoy the sun depending on where you are, or the rain maybe. It's coming here. And thanks again to all of you for listening.
Thanks a lot for organizing this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.